Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be discussing today the National Register of Historic Places and the top tips on how to submit successful nominations for it with Abby Marshall from the State Historic Preservation Office. Before we begin, I just wanted to go over a couple quick things with everyone. First off, if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the chat box, and we will get those questions answered once Abby finishes her presentation. If you experience any problems during the webinar with your sound or slides don't seem to be moving in the right way, just close down the webinar, click the link that was sent to you, sign back in, and that will solve most of your problems. And likewise, if you're using a telephone, just hang up, dial back in, and that will solve your problems for you. This webinar is registered for 1 LU credit for AIA members. I'm going to put the form for sign up in the chat box in case anyone needs those credits. And I'll mention this again once we get towards the end of the webinar, just to remind everyone to fill that form out so you get your credits. So let's talk about our presenter for a second. Abby Marshall is the Survey and National Register Manager for Inventory and Registration for the State Historic Preservation Office at the Ohio History Connection. She holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Geography with a concentration in Travel and Tourism, as well as a Master's of Science degree in Historic Preservation from Ball State University. She began working at the Preservation Office in 2021, and she currently serves as the op chair for the Heritage Ohio Board. So without further ado, I'll turn things over to Abby. Thank you.
Alrighty, hello everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar. As Devin said, my name is in fact Abby Marshall, and I work at the Ohio SHPO. I predominantly work with this program and assist in getting properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So today I'm going to walk you through what the program is and what it takes to nominate a property. And then, as Devin said, at the end, I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys have. So first and foremost, what is the National Register of Historic Places? The National Register of Historic Places is an official list of properties deemed worthy of preservation for their significance in American history, archaeology, architecture, engineering, and culture. The National Register was created by the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966 as amended to identify and inventory historic resources around the country. The National Register listing tells property owners, local officials, interested groups, and citizens that you have something worthy of preservation. However, it leaves decision-making about what that means to the property owner and potentially other interested properties. A property can be listed at the local, state, or national level. However, most of them are listed at the local level. Ohio actually does a really fantastic job in listing properties. You can see that here in the graph we have on the slide, but there are actually more than 4,000 listings in Ohio and over 50,000 historic properties that have been identified within these listings. And with that, Ohio is ranked third in the country for the amount of listings that we have on the National Register. Taking a look back, as I mentioned, the National Register was created in 1966. And even though some of these types are still getting listed today, the early years of the program saw many listings as the obvious historical feats or architectural gems or, resources that are obviously significant in our past. I grabbed some photos that you can see on the slide and examples. So Serpent Mound, the State House, Union Terminal, Oak Hill Cottage in Mansfield. That one might not be as widely known, but you can see it's a beautiful example of Gothic revival. So all of these properties are no doubt significant in our history in Ohio and no doubt deserve to be listed on the National Register. However, as time moved on, the program expanded. And with that, our definition of historically significant properties expanded. And we began to see an increase in different types of nominated properties. And some of them you may not think of as stereotypically significant, But we start to see some different resources: vernacular houses, apartment buildings, farmsteads, industrial complexes. And while these properties are a little different, they still reflected significant themes in our past or held significant local influence to the communities that they existed in. And as we go further, we see more of the ever polarizing postmodern designs. And while not considered quote unquote historic when the National Register began, many of these examples of architecture are now 50 plus years old. And love them or hate them, they represent a very significant shift in architectural and building design history. And all of this evolution is to show that the National Register is always growing and adapting, but at its core, we still follow the same basic guidelines and regulations that were set from its inception. And I will get into those a little bit later. The final piece of that evolution of the National Register that I want to touch on before we get into some of the more nitty-gritty items is the efforts that have been made to preserve underrepresented communities. Buildings and places of our past have ways of disappearing, especially when their histories are not as self-evident as the grandiose architectural statements or a long-remembered association with a town founder or local leader. And we realized that many historic properties associated with African American civil rights history that once defined these places are gone, demolished, or have been replaced. In borrowing a phrase calling for federal civil rights legislation in the 1960s, we felt the fierce urgency of now to create tools to assist in nominating qualifying properties associated with African American history to the National Register. On our website, you can find the National Register multiple property documentation for African American civil rights movement in Ohio, 1900 to 1970. You can find sample National Register nominations and online guidance to help prepare in our nominations, and obviously I'll get into those later as well. And we have a position in our office that is grant funded by the National Park Service that is specifically to help identify these properties. And it's filled by my coworker, Diamond Crowder, who is an absolutely fantastic human and great at her job. And you can reach out to her if you have any questions about nominating properties that are underrepresented in communities. Alrighty, so let's talk about the National Register program. What does it do and not do? So first off, what does it do? It serves as an important planning and education tool. When properties within a community are recognized in the National Register, property owners and local decision makers know what properties are significant and can use that information to make informed decisions. It identifies significant historic resources and raises awareness of the value of historic preservation. Additionally, properties listed individually or part of a historic district listed in the National Register or determined eligible for the National Register are given special consideration in the planning of federally funded or licensed projects. Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act requires that all federally funded projects be coordinated with the SHPO to determine their impact upon historic properties. This review is a routine part of the planning process for federally assisted projects. The review does not guarantee that the property will not be affected or even demolished, but it does ensure that there will be an opportunity to consider effects of the project before it occurs. Lastly, there are economic reinvestment incentives. Obviously, we all like money, so there are some tax incentives. Income producing buildings, commercial or residential rental listed in the National Register or contributing to an NR listed historic district may qualify for state and federal historic tax credits for rehabilitation of a historic building. This does not apply to condos and single family private residences. That key thing is that it has to be income producing. The National Register nomination helps in the review of these projects by describing character-defining features and clearly presenting significance and a significance time period for that property. Alrighty, now the most hot button topic for the National Register, and this is probably, and by probably I mean 100%, the question I get asked the most. What does listing in the National Register not do? It does not affect property owners' rights. Listing in the National Register places neither restrictions nor requirements on a private property owner. You may do with a property as you wish, within the framework of local laws or ordinances. National Register listings should not be confused with the community's local ordinances that may be set up by design review. NR may be the impetus for initiating local guidelines, but not a direct result of NR listing. You're not required to maintain the property in any specific way, and you can even demolish the property as long as federal funds are not used. Obviously, as preservationists, we don't want you to do that, but this is something that is important to note, especially when you're nominating historic districts with many property owners who are very often concerned about what a listing means in terms of their rights to their property. And it's a valid concern. And so it's good to know this, and it's good to let them know this before you start nominating so they're comfortable. And if you let them know this and they still have concerns, you can always send them my way. I'm more than happy to chat with them. All right, let's talk resource types. So the National Park Service has established 5 categories of resource types for nomination to the National Register. First off, we have buildings, which are properties created principally to shelter any form of human activity. So houses, barns, schools, I'm sure you all know what buildings are. We have structures, and that would be functional constructions made for purposes other than creating shelters, such as bridges, dams, and canal locks. So the key difference here is shelter versus not shelter. There are sites. Sites are locations of a significant event, occupation, or activity. This could be a design landscape, a cemetery, archaeological sites, things of that nature. And then objects. Objects are constructions primarily artistic or small in scale, such as a sculpture, monuments, or fountains. Lastly, we have historic districts, and they are a significant concentration of sites, buildings, structures, or objects united historically or aesthetically by plan or physical development. This could be residential neighborhoods, downtown commercial districts, college campuses, or even archaeological districts. Historic districts, because they're a collection of resources, they can include contributing and non-contributing resources. All right, now what makes a property eligible for the National Register? Typically, we're looking at these 3 key items. First is age. Generally, the property needs to be more than 50 years old. There are some exceptions, which I'll talk about later. Second, the property must be significant in one of 4 aspects of American history recognized by the National Register criteria, and this is nominated at a local, state, or national level. And then Finally, the property must have historic integrity, and this is made evident through historic qualities and/or materials through the 7 aspects of integrity set by the National Park Service. And this is through location, design, materials, workmanship, setting, feeling, and association. As mentioned in the previous slide, properties need to meet one or more of the 4 criteria, and we keep it pretty simple. It's A, B, C, or D. First off, A, properties nominated under criterion A are associated with events that have made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. So I have 2 examples here. First is the Shenandoah crash that happened in 1925. The Shenandoah was the first rigid airship built in the US in 1923, I believe. It crashed from a thunderstorm during a Midwestern tour, and the crash had a pretty significant impact on the later development of the Navy's airship program and actually brought about technological changes in airship design to prevent crashes like this from happening again. And additionally, it was noted as the most important event in Noble County. The photo on the right is the Arlington School. Under criterion A, the building served as the first and only school building in Arlington Heights for 80 years, from 1934 to 2014, and is significant in the area of education, locally representing the community's educational history. It was one of the first school buildings to be completed in Ohio during the Great Depression under the Federal Public Works Administration, which enabled construction of more than 3,000 school buildings throughout the country to provide modern educational facilities. So again, both of these examples are representing broad patterns or themes in our history. Next up, we have National Register Criterion B. The property is significant through its association with the productive life of an individual whose specific contributions to history can be identified and documented. And that keyword here is productive life, or 2 keywords. The building needs to relate to the person while they were achieving significance. So for example, on the left, you see the J.M. Smucker house. So he actually lived in this house during key years of the production for his products, and the factory is actually located right across the street from there. And then to the right, you see Irma Bombeck's house, and she lived there while she was a famous writer. Next, we have criterion C, which deals with different type of architecture and design and engineering. So first up, we have design and construction. This could be a type of building. So we have here the Wyandotte County Jail and Sheriff's Residence. It could be a style. Again, here's that Oak Hill Cottage in Mansfield. But it's basically something that embodies the distinct characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction. It could be representing artistic value or the work of a master. Up at the top here, we have the Ohio Departments of State office building. It's a modern office building designed to represent the greatness of Ohio through its art and architecture. So it's got sculpture and artwork that symbolizes the history, natural resources, industries, and achievements of Ohio and its people. And then down at the bottom there is a bank in Newark that is done by famous Chicago architect Louis Sullivan. It's one of 17 small bank designs that he did across the Midwest, and it was kind of known as a prelude to modernism. We also can nominate under C for engineering and method of construction. We tend to see a lot of bridges come in for engineering. Method of construction up here, we have the Ingalls building. It was the first use of reinforced concrete in a skyscraper in the US, so pretty significant. And we also have properties representing a distinguishable entity. Here's an example of the Carver Edition, which is an FHA suburb that's composed of Cape Cod houses that was built for African American veterans in 1946 to 1947. Finally, we have National Register Criterion D, and this deals with archaeology. So properties that have yielded or may be likely to yield information important in prehistory or history. So when you've identified that there's something significant there, typically underground, and that you can likely find more information about your history by exploring that area more, that's when it's going to be under criteria D. As I mentioned, there's some extenuating circumstances. The criteria considerations are for properties that don't typically meet the typical nomination qualifications, but fit a certain set of exceptional standards. And I've got them listed here: cemeteries, birthplaces or graves. We typically see cemeteries for architecture or designed landscapes. Religious properties, moved structures, reconstructed buildings, commemorative properties, and properties less than 50 years old. I would say most often we see religious properties, and that's typically because they are often very high style architecture. Alrighty, now the last three of those ingredients I mentioned earlier is integrity. Integrity is defined as the ability of a property to convey its historic significance. Identifying which of the 7 aspects of integrity are most important to a particular property requires an understanding of the property's physical features and how they relate to its significance. A property does not need to meet all the aspects, but should meet multiple. The biggest misconception to note when assessing a property's historic integrity is that condition does not equal integrity. So I have some photos over here, and let's be honest, the building's looking pretty rough. There's clearly some water damage here. You might look at it and be grabbing for your N95 mask, maybe a hard hat, or even be like, I'm just gonna stay outside. I'm gonna let you guys handle this one. But in the eyes of historic integrity, you have to identify what the building is, why it's significant, and are there key materials or features that reflect this? And so here we have a school. It was being nominated under criterion A for education. And so what are we seeing? I'm seeing a stage and an auditorium. I'm seeing on the left what looks like an open layout of a classroom, some built-in shelving and cabinets. I'm seeing what appears to be original bay windows. I'm seeing a large space that doesn't appear to have been divided. So overall, what we can see are spaces and materials that were not changed, and you can tell what they were originally used for. And that would be school activities, educational purposes. And even though the condition is rough, we can see the historic integrity in the design of the room, the original materials, the workmanship, and you're still getting that feeling and association of a classroom in an auditorium. All righty, so let's talk a little bit about the National Register nomination process. Now that we know what makes a property qualify for nomination, we can look at the process. So anybody can nominate a property. It typically begins with filling out a preliminary National Register questionnaire. I should note, anyone can nominate a property, but if it's an individual building, you do need exterior and interior photos. So if you're nominating someone else's like house or building and you can't get into it to take photos, that might not work. And we definitely don't recommend sneaking in. But here's the process if you can legally nominate it. So you send in that preliminary questionnaire, and it is just a brief overview of the property. It gives some information such as criteria, integrity, photographs, and it's basically serving as a brief outline of what the nomination would look like. We do have this on our website. And then there's a committee of SHPO staff that reviews it. And if they feel it qualifies for nomination, then we give it the green light, and the form preparer can fill out the in our nomination form. Once the first draft nomination is received by our office, we have 60 days to complete a technical and substantive review of the nomination. Each nomination is assigned to one of our reviewers, and then the reviewers work collaboratively with the form preparer to make the appropriate revisions to the nomination to get it ready to present in review for the state review board. So each state varies in their process a little bit, but all nominations basically go through a SHPO, a state level review, and the federal review. So for us, our state level review is what we call our OSHBAB. So this is a 17-member board. It is the Ohio Historic Site Preservation Advisory Board. It's appointed by the governor to advise the State Historic Preservation Office and the Ohio History Connection Board of Trustees on historic preservation issues. The State Review Board plays an important role in the National Register of Historic Places program. The board holds 4 meetings each year to recommend Ohio properties for nomination to the National Register of Historic Places. We present all the nominations to our board. They provide a recommendation of whether or not they think the nomination should be listed in the National Register. And they also provide feedback for any revisions that they feel may be needed. Following that, we work with the form preparer to make any changes needed to the nomination and send it to the National Park Service, and then they have 45 days to review it. And then if it's all good to go, it's officially listed. So it's a long process, but at the Ohio SHPO, we really try to work with you before we even get it to the board to make sure it's in good shape. We want to make sure once we get it to the board and National Park Service, it's good to go and it is just smooth sailing. Now, the nominations themselves to get to that point of smooth sailing need to have a few things. It's important to place your property into the greater context of where it's located and within the time period it's significant. For example, we were talking about the Arlington School earlier and how it was significant because it was one of the early schools built during the Great Depression under the Federal Public Works Administration. And that's giving the context of what was happening when it was constructed and why it is significant and important. B, based on scholarly research and evaluation. That's pretty straightforward. Make sure you're using good documents for your research. No Wikipedia, no websites that are giving you false information. Just make sure you're using good documents. And it doesn't all have to be primary resource. It can be secondary resources as well. Just make sure you're using good stuff. The next one is comparative analysis with like properties. All nominations need to have this. You need to discuss how your property compares and contrasts from other like properties. Let's say you have a house designed by a prominent local architect? Did they design other houses in the area? Are any of them remaining? What are the key features in their design that reflect this one? Things like this should be included. Show importance within the theme. So what is it being nominated for? Is it education? Is it industry? Is it commerce? Just make sure you're really supporting that theme. We've already talked about integrity, but you just, again, need to make sure you're showing that. More than one property of a type could be significant, but not all properties associated with the theme are automatically significant. Support why this specific property is significant in its own right. So basically, you need to support why this property is not just one of the many. There's a bulletin for that. So the National Park Service has many in our bulletins and updated documents, helpful guides that are available on their website specific for filling out National Register forms. They provide helpful guidance for applying National Register criteria and assessing integrity for specific property types and aspects of history. So I do recommend checking those out if you need guidance. Additionally, we have guidance on our website, and we're actually currently working to update all of it. I can't remember the last time it was updated, but we should have all of those updates uploaded in May at the latest. So we're really excited about that. As some of you may know, maybe not know, we've changed a lot over the last however many years NR's been going, especially in terms of technology. We no longer use, slides. So a lot of those things have changed, photo policies and whatnot. So we're really eager to have all of that updated information for you all to use. All right. Something else that I wanted to talk to y'all about is the nomination itself. So it's made up of many parts. It's kind of a long nomination, but the two big pieces are the narrative description and then section 8, which is the statement of significance. So the narrative description is really where you're going to talk about the current physical representation of the property or district. And it's going to begin with a summary paragraph where you're just basically outlining the integrity, some simple characteristics, essentially a very short summary of what you're going to be talking about below. And then when you get down to the narrative, you'll be describing the setting, the exterior and interior of the building for individual nominations. If you're doing a district, it's going to be more like the exterior representation of the buildings, the layout and flow of the streets. If it's a really small district, you can describe all of the buildings if you'd like. It should also discuss alterations, identify original materials, character defining features. You want to make sure you're clear on what's original and what's not. But again, you don't need to describe what it looked like historically necessarily. You want the current physical description. Just make sure you're saying, hey, these historic materials are still here, because that's going to come into play with integrity and that future planning process. It needs to be organized. You need to cross-reference your photos and resource numbers if you're nominating a district. And this is also the section where at the end, you're going to address your integrity and you're going to talk about the 7 aspects of integrity and discuss what of those your property still has. Something else, I guess I'll just throw out there too, that we've got a lot of feedback from the board about. It's okay to state that maybe your property doesn't have a lot of integrity and like materials left, but its strength is in feeling and association or setting. So it's okay to plainly state that and say, hey, but it's super strong in this other way of integrity. Just be clear. And a lot of times, too, I mean, if you're nominating under A, it's not as important that its design and materials are still there. Because if you're going for C in architecture, obviously that's the important part is design and materials. But if you're going for A, that's really not what the significance is. So just think about your property and what's important, what story is being told here. All right, and as I said, the second part, the statement of significance. Um, this is where, well, you're supporting your significance, pretty straightforward. It's going to have a summary statement as well. You're going to talk about your criteria, your area of significance, your period of significance. This is where you'll have your comparative analysis, your context. You're going to evaluate your property. All that stuff I was talking about earlier and what should be in a nomination is basically going to be in this part. One other thing I want to note is you should be using your footnotes throughout because you're going to have a bibliography at the end. And you can use whatever style you want. I think people for nominations typically go to Chicago style. And you could just Google Chicago style on, well, Google, and it'll come up. All right, funding sources for National Register nominations. So there is opportunity to get some help money-wise with these. First off, I'll just say we do have a consultants list on our website. We, as a SHPO, cannot recommend anybody specifically, but we do have that list on there that you can access. The certified local government grants is run through our office. It is a competitive grant, and I think it closes actually April 30th, but you can still apply. That information is on our website, or you can reach out to me and I can help you out with that more. The Ohio History Connection History Fund grants. Oof. Andy Veerhoff, my coworker, runs that program. I'm not sure when the next round comes in. He just got done handing out what he calls big checks, which are exactly what you think they are, big checks, to some different communities around the state that received those. They're available to nonprofits and public entities. It's competitive as well, and it requires a match. But again, reach out to me. I can put you in contact with him. And then the pipeline grant, it's non-competitive. It's run through the Ohio Department of Development, and it's reserved for districts and individual properties that are seeking help for nominations, and they're planning to take advantage of those rehabilitation tax credits. There's no application deadline. It opens up July 1st, I'm pretty sure, but there's no deadline. However, it's non-competitive. It's first come, first serve. So I recommend getting your application in sooner rather than later. And just again, if you have questions about that, you can email me and I'll put you in contact with Lisa Brownell, who kind of works on that program. I'm pretty sure she said they don't have the portal up yet on the website to apply or get information necessarily. So just let me know and I'll put you in contact with her. All right, I keep saying let me know, reach out to me. So here's my email. We work predominantly remotely, so email is the best way to reach me. And thank you all for listening. I'm happy to answer your questions. And again, thank you so much.
Thanks, Abby. As Abby said, now is the time to type in your questions if you have any into the chat box. We already have a few up there, I see. But we're just going to take a short commercial break here to give you guys a couple of moments to type those in. First off, we'd like to thank the Ohio Department of Development for giving us funding towards these every year. Thanks again. And we have a couple upcoming events. First up, coming up, we have a tour on April 13th of the historic Corey United Methodist Church. It's an important civil rights site in Cleveland. The Young Ohio Preservationists are organizing this tour, and you can find more information and register for the tour. I believe there are 4 spaces available on our website, heritageohio.org. Also coming up, we have engaging with Asian American heritage in our downtown communities. This is an on-site presentation at the Ohio History Center in Columbus. We're going to be discussing the impacts of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders on downtown communities, historic preservation of those sites, and also how to get those sites recognized in Ohio. We have a presenter coming from History Pin, and we will also have some tickets available. There's still a few left on our website, heritageohio.org. And finally, coming up, we have our next revitalization series workshop, Transform Your Downtown with Local Entrepreneurs and Local Ordinances. This presentation is going to be on April 16th. We're going to be discussing women-owned businesses in downtown Middletown, key elements to downtown Middletown's transformational strategy using art and entertainment, and also vacant property legislation during this workshop. Tickets are available, heritageohio.org. All right. And before we get moving on, I'm going to paste into the chat box once again, just in case anyone who signed on a little bit later didn't see it. If you need AIA credits for this presentation, they are available, 1 LU unit, and the form to sign up, I just put in the chat box, so you should see it in a second. All right, Abby, our first question here is, how long does it take to have a property that is threatened by demolition to be listed?
Well, typically nominations, it varies. It really varies per nomination just because every property has its nuances. Typically, they take anywhere from 6 to 9 months, again, depending on the complexity. I will say you would want to get it in before it's, demolished, because if the property's gone, there's nothing to nominate. And I'll just reiterate again that the National Register really doesn't, unfortunately, it doesn't help save properties. If you're really looking for some type of way to prevent that demolition, you're going to have to look locally and reach out to your local government to find a way to, I don't know, potentially list it locally.
Thanks, Abby. Next question, kind of getting into the application itself. Can you explain how a historic context statement relates to the aspects of integrity needed to convey the property's historic significance? There's the second part, but let's answer that one first.
Can you read that one more time?
Sure. Can you explain how a historic context statement relates to the aspects of integrity needed to convey the property's historic significance?
Historic. Okay. Let's see. You hit all the keywords there. Integrity to historic significance. So basically, and I'm sorry if I don't answer this right. So when you're looking at context, you're placing it into the context of, like, maybe I could try to answer this with an example. So let's say you have a school like the Arlington School, and let's pretend there was 2 schools built right beside each other using the same funds, the PWA or WPA funds. And we had the Arlington School that still had a lot of its integrity, but this other school had been turned already into like a different type of property. It lost a lot of its had been divided up on the inside. They tore off a bunch of the front materials, and you're looking at that historic significance as an educational school. You can look at it as, well, this one property is still, it still has its historic significance is education. You're looking at the integrity as it's representing those spaces, like I mentioned, with the auditorium and the classroom spaces, and you're placing it into the context of school in this local area. So that's what you're looking at when you're placing it into that larger context. Does that make sense?
To me, it does. We'll see if L has any comments coming in on that. L's second part of his question here is, can you evaluate a property's integrity before understanding the property's historic context?
You can, to an extent, if you're looking at its significance. I think you can get an idea. It's better to know its context and where it sits. It's tough because the context really helps support the significance. I think if it's, I'll just stick with the school example. If it's a school, you know that its significance is going to be lying in those educational spaces. If it's an industrial building, you know that it was used as, like maybe it's a warehouse. You're going to be looking for those wide open spaces, the delivery doors. So in that sense, you can get an idea. But the context is important because you're looking at the greater surroundings. I mean, unfortunately, like I'll use downtown Columbus. You know, downtown Columbus might have some historic buildings, but they love to demolish and build up all these new ones. So when you look downtown, maybe there's a building that you were like, oh, it'd be so great to nominate it, but everything around it is new build. And let's say they've also tore up the inside, it's that context is kind of lost when you're looking around as like a downtown commercial building. And so even though it's, let's say it's significant as like a shop, it's really gone because that whole context is lost as a downtown shopping area. So you can, but it's really a case by case basis, which is kind of hard. That's why we really recommend sending in NRQs. Um, they're really the preliminary questionnaires. They're really meant for us to give you an idea of if it qualifies, so that you don't go down a rabbit hole nominating a property if ultimately it's just not going to work out.
Thanks, Abby. Question for me. This webinar is going to be available to everyone. You should be getting a copy of it in your email tomorrow afternoon. Also, we always post our webinars to our YouTube channel. Go to YouTube and just search Heritage Ohio. There's a channel that it should be the first option that will take you to all of our recordings. We have about, I think, 13 or 14 years now of webinars up there. So there's plenty to choose from. So that copy of that will be up probably this evening. And if you want to wait on the email, that'll come tomorrow afternoon to everyone. All right, Abby, Don is asking, do you have suggestions for good places to get information about buildings? Things like old photos, ownership records, use history, and other relevant info.
Oh yeah. Newspapers, online newspaper archives are great, local libraries, Sanborn maps, a lot of them, actually, if you're looking in Ohio, Kent State has a great collection of Sanborn maps online. If you want to go to Ohio History Connection, our archives, we have a lot of county histories and city directories. For historic photos, I would say going to local libraries or like shoot, I'm just blinking. But yeah, again, all my newspapers I've honestly had the most success with, or going to like local museums or history groups or anything like that. Any historical organization or nonprofit in the area, you'd be surprised at how many photos they just have in the back that they haven't looked at. And one other thing I started doing, if there's a random Facebook page of like for a city or a town for the history of it, they'll post photos that they just have like in their house. And I found some great photos. I was doing a district for downtown Zanesville a couple years ago, and I pulled some really great photos from a Facebook page that people were just posting on. So that's kind of a random one to look into.
Some good answers there. So the next question is about creating the nomination. We have a Lustron house. To get it registered, can we copy information from previous nominations regarding the historic significance as long as it relates to our house? And do we need to make the nomination, or do we need to make the nominations all original?
You could, I wouldn't copy and paste, but you can pull that information, just reference that nomination in the footnotes and in the bibliography.
All right. Next question is, if a property is eligible for the National Register, but they aren't nominated to the National Register, can you still apply for tax credits? So you might have an answer for this one.
Yeah, so it needs to be listed to get the tax credits, but you can, if you're planning to list it, you can send in a preliminary part one if you're going to be in the process of listing it. But yes, you have to be listed to officially receive those.
And our next question is on an application underway. I am in the process of working on a nomination for a historic 19th century farmstead. Can you talk a little bit more about the difference or special considerations to take when nominating a farmstead as a historic district versus a historic neighborhood with multiple property owners?
Oh, ooh, that's an interesting one. So I guess if my understanding is correct, it's a farmstead with different resources that are owned by different people, which I guess would be a rural district. Um, yeah, I guess you would use it as like you would nominate it as a rural district, and you would have to do a resource count for each of the resources, like an inventory sheet, which can be found on our website. And we would need to notify each of the owners, um, and they would have their chance to speak to the nomination. So I would say you should probably talk to all of them first and let them know what you're doing. Um, that way you're all on the same page. But it sounds like it's going to be a district where you're resource counting if it's different parcels.
And our next question here is, what does it take to get a nationally registered property delisted?
So delisting is a little complicated. To delist a property, you have to prove that it has lost its significance or integrity. If it has, you would submit, there's a sheet, you basically could put it on continuation sheets and it goes through our office and it actually goes through our board and they vote on it. So I would say if you feel it's lost its integrity or significance, you can reach out to me and I can work through that process with you. But if it has not, delisting just really isn't an option.
Next question here is, what are some reasons why property owners oppose National Register listings, particularly when it doesn't prevent them from doing things? Now, I think this is mostly talking about a National Register district.
Uh, that's a great question. I can't really speak to it. I personally haven't had that happen since I've been at SHPO, so I don't have any answer for you other than maybe people just they're not comfortable with it. Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I would love to know, but I just don't. I think the biggest thing you can do is just be sure to, if you're going to nominate a district, let them know ahead of time. Something I will mention, our SHPO staff is happy to come down and do a talk with people at any point in the process. We have PDFs and flyers that talk about what the National Register does and doesn't do. I've gone as far as sending the regulations from the National Park Service that state that they can do what they want. So the best thing you can do is just keep everybody involved and be upfront and forward.
And Heather, I will also say that in our experience at our office, a lot of the times it's misinformation that has been spread by one or more individuals. Either it's just misconceptions or outright misinformation. Also, people are very concerned, obviously, about property rules and design guidelines, and those kind of overlap a little bit. Those are the two big ones we've encountered with oppositions when we mention them as a possibility for a community. Usually it's like, I'm afraid they're going to tell me what color of paint to put on my property. That's not going to happen. Things like that. But, I think particularly more information, the better, more upfrontness with people, more meetings, kind of holding people's hand along the way, letting people know the whole process, that at the end of the day, they really aren't going to be told what paint's going to go on their property. They're not going to be prevented from making alterations, things like that. Okay, our next question here. Let me get the whole question in the photo here. All right. Are county governments and or libraries being encouraged to subscribe to the state inventory for local organizations and citizens to access?
I am not sure on that one. Yeah, I'm not sure.
All right.
I don't think I can answer that one.
It's all right. I think it's, more what the libraries in particular,
Yeah,
the
I think
governments, that's another beast, but libraries, it's,
right.
what they're interested in doing. So I'm sure if an individual was like, yes, I would be very interested in having these, I'm sure a library would explore it. And,
Yes.
and sometimes, yeah, as Richard's mentioning here in his comment, you have to pay to access it. Unfortunately, that's what some libraries decide to do. Counties also decide to do that a lot of the time to allay their costs. But other libraries, I mean, if you make a good enough case, I think they'll consider changing the fee structure or eliminating it entirely. So you can always do that. And also Richard's mentioning of the fees that the Ohio History Connection charges too on access. All right. Next question, we got a couple more on the applications. Can you explain what multiple property documents are and how they relate to nominating properties?
So the multiple property documentations are actually, they're trying to provide an overarching context. So basically, and I'll use an example. So they still go through the same process of a nomination, but for example, that African American civil rights one I was talking about, somebody, well, I think actually it came from us, but the MPD was done, and it's this huge context for that specific subject across the state. And so it lays out different areas or criterion that can, lays out different criterion and areas of significance for future properties that can be listed underneath it. And so the idea is that properties that fit those criterion in the areas of significance that are already listed in this MPD can be listed under it. And it's a quicker way to nominate those properties without having to dig into that context because it's already been written in this document. So what you can do is say you're nominating it under this document and you don't have to deep dive into that history because it's already written. And so it's just meant to be a quicker way to nominate properties associated with this theme.
And our next question is it important to include an inventory form with the application?
If you are doing a district, you have to have an inventory form.
And what are some of the most common areas of applications that once people have submitted them and your office reviews them and you suggest changes, what areas are you typically seeing people needing to rework or improve upon?
I would say probably the comparative analysis are the big ones, which I mean, it can be hard to kind of take a step back and find those things. It requires a little bit more research too, and sometimes it's just not there. But the comparative analysis, I think, is the biggest thing. And, with that, I'll just say, and I think I mentioned it earlier, we really try to be collaborative and we will give you ideas and help you throughout that. Um, we don't just say, hey, fix this, and then you have to figure it out. We'll give you ideas and what our thoughts are. So when things come in, if you don't know, just kind of do what you can. And you can even put in the comments, like, I don't know where to go with this. Can you give me recommendations? And we are happy to help.
And how many nominations per year are getting approved in Ohio on
Oof.
average?
Um, on average, it really varies, but I would guess, I don't know, maybe around around 20, if I think 20 to 30. Don't quote me on that though.
I know most of this conversation we've been talking about individual nominations, but
Mhm,
time commitment for doing a National Register district, what should people
mhm.
be looking at when doing that?
It again, it's just gonna depend on the size of the district, but if it's a larger one, it's it's a lot of work. I would say probably anywhere from 9 months to a year and a half if it's a big district.
Definitely apply for those pipeline funds so you can hire somebody.
Absolutely. It's it's a beast. And I've worked with some people who are not consultants to nominate a district, but it's not easy. They're doing their best, but it's going to take some time.
All right. Any final questions you have, type them in now. Thanks again to Abby for doing this. Any final comments for you to encourage people to get those nominations in?
I'll just say reach out to me. I am happy to help. I have helped so many people that have never done nominations before. Honestly, it's kind of my favorite thing to do. Don't tell the consultants, but I really enjoy it. And I promise I'm easy to work with. So reach out to me with any questions. Don't be scared about the nomination. It looks daunting, but once we sit down and walk through it, it's not as scary as it seems. I promise.
Thanks, Abby. All right. One more question here from Laura. If we are already in a historic district, is there any advantage to applying for designation of an individual building?
No, if you're contributing in the district, then no. If you're non-contributing, then you would maybe want to look at amending it so that you could be contributing. But there's no further advantage if you're already contributing in the district.
All right. And could you define contributing versus non-contributing for people?
Yeah, contributing means that you have integrity and you fit in with that historic significance of the district nomination. Non-contributing means that either the building was built outside of the period of significance, it no longer reflects the significance during that period of significance, or there's been too many changes, or it no longer retains historic integrity. So basically it's saying it's in the boundary, so you have to count it as a resource, but it's not reflecting the significance or integrity of the district.
And are there any available guidelines for people to kind of help them make that determination, or should they just contact your office?
Oh yeah, there's guidelines. So those NPS bulletins, there's one, it's 15 or 6, it's 15, nope, 16. It's Bulletin 16 that's on our website, or the NPS one, and it's all about integrity, assessing integrity and the criterion. So look on there, and that'll help you with identifying contributing and non-contributing. And it's if you go to our website or you go to Ohio History Connection, there is a Preserving Ohio tab, and then there's going to be a National Register of Historic Places tab, and you can go in there and you can find guidance from us.
Thanks, Abby.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I do not see any more questions. So thanks everyone for joining us today for our webinar. Thanks again to Abby and the SHPO office for doing this wonderful presentation for us. Our next webinar is on April 24th. It's going to be looking at statistical information, how to collect it, and how to use it for promoting your downtown. Thanks everyone. Have a good day.